final Sunday in our series on the book of Ruth. Not just the book of Ruth, though. This little book appears early in the Old Testament, and it's really an example for all time. It's a story of how God works through the faithfulness of those who follow Him, how God provides through tragedy, and how He calls us to provide for one another. Now, I know this series has been thick with history and context. There's some nuance. There's some euphemisms in various things that are in this story. It started out with a man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi fleeing a famine in Bethlehem. They were only 1 to 2 generations into the promised land for the Israelites, and they had to flee back out of it because of the famine. So they went to a nation called Moab, and they had 2 sons, and those sons married women from Moab. But then the sons died. Well, then Elimelech died, and the sons died, and Naomi was left with her 2 daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. She told them both to go on and go find husbands for themselves, and they both said no, but eventually Orpah, with Naomi's encouragement, went and stayed in Moab. But Naomi was going back home to Bethlehem, and Ruth said to her, "I will go with you. Where you go, I will go. Your God will be my God, and your people will be my people." The story of Ruth is also a course of Ruth's understanding of how the people of Israel operate, how their God has enabled them to operate with faith and with hope. And then in chapter 3, we reach kind of a tense point at which Ruth, who had been allowed to glean on the edges of the fields of a man named Boaz and had been under Boaz's protection, goes and asks, with Naomi's encouragement, asks Boaz to help, to be her redeemer, which in those terms, in legal terms, kinsman redeemer, meant that he would take on the role of his close relative, who would have been Naomi's husband and Ruth's husband, and take them into his house, marry her, and take on that role that had been provided for by the Jewish law. Now, when this happened, when Ruth made this request of Boaz, Boaz wanted to do it. But he had said there's somebody else who also has a claim to that title of kinsman redeemer. And in chapter 3, this happened on the threshing floor, which was one of the town commons areas in ancient villages. It's where people would take their grain to be threshed, beaten, and then tossed up, sifted in the air. It was a big party place, a festive atmosphere. Ruth had gone to the threshing floor at night during the harvest celebration. She had lain beside Boaz and asked him to take care of her. Throughout this month, I've been focusing on the way that the book of Ruth articulates the differences between Yahweh, the God of Israel, and the other gods of different nations at the time. Ruth had come from one of these other nations. And I've mentioned that Yahweh is unique because he was not a God who just blessed and cursed the Israelites on a whim, but rather a God who had given them a promise that they sought to live into as people. The promise that he would bless them for generations and that the other nations would be blessed through them. Now, I did not mention this last week, but and this is why this is not a G-rated beginning to the sermon here, but one of the ways that Yahweh's uniqueness was on display at that threshing floor through the interaction of Boaz and Ruth, and especially the way it was written down and told. It was very reserved. There was some romantic tension written into the chapter. There's some euphemisms used there. But in contrast to the practices of other nations at harvest time, it was very different. Ruth came to Boaz at night, and they were very coy about whatever went on, and said that what Boaz would do would be to go to the city gate and ask the elders and ask the other person who could have been the kinsman redeemer if it was all right with them. Very methodical. Other nations, not Israel because they believed in one God, the one true God, but other nations believed in gods and goddesses of fertility. So if there was a famine, then that meant that the god or goddess was obviously mad at the people. Nothing was growing, so people probably shouldn't try to reproduce either. I mean, they did, but if there was a time of plenty, then obviously the god or goddess of fertility was very happy with the people, so probably ought to take advantage of that. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about whimsical gods. In other nations, pagan nations, if the goddess of fertility was in a good mood, that didn't just have to do with crops. It had to do with people as well. So when there was a party to celebrate the harvest, the people took advantage of the fertility goddess's good mood, if you catch my drift. But the book of Ruth is very coy. It's okay to laugh. Thank you, Ann. The book of Ruth is very coy about what happened between Ruth and Boaz on the threshing floor. But if this were a story written in another pagan religion about another nation's gods, then it would have been very explicit, because the people themselves would have been very explicit. But following a non-whimsical God requires us to take stock of a lot of things in our lives. Not just striking when the iron is hot, but also not recoiling in fear when things might seem scary, like with a famine. Rather, following a non-whimsical God who operates by making promises and calling others to faithfulness, that means following faithfully and trusting that God is at work. Not just jumping on every opportunity or being scared when things might seem foreboding. For the people in the book of Ruth, it meant that trusting God would work out for the ways that he had set forth. So this is not just a story about pagan fertility gods and taking advantage of their good moods. This is a story about a God who makes a long-term promise. In fact, when God made the promise that he would bless Israel and bless their descendants, he made it to a man named Abram, who became Abraham. The problem at that time was that Abram and his wife were very old and didn't have any kids. But instead of believing God's promise that he would give them descendants, Abram and his wife Sarai agreed together to try to have a child through their servant Hagar. That child was named Ishmael, and God was not too happy that Abram and Sarai had tried to force things. But eventually, against all odds, God allowed Sarah to become pregnant with Isaac. Because Isaac was a child by virtue of God's promise, God considered Isaac to be the true son of Abraham. True children were the children of God's promise, of faith. Now, was that insensitive to Ishmael? Maybe so. But God's point was that he wanted things done his way. He's not a God of people just doing things on their own out of either fear or fancy. He's a God of making a long-term plan and sticking to it. People don't thrive because they happen to luck out and they caught God on a good day. No, they truly thrive and flourish when they get in step with God's plan. So if there's a famine in the land, or if there's abundance in the land, it doesn't matter because God's promise continues. Therefore, when there's a great harvest and there are lots of people there to celebrate it, it's okay to play it cool. The people of other nations might have seen a harvest as an opportunity to take advantage of their fertility god's mood, but for a faithful Israelite like Boaz, it was just one of many blessings in God's long-term plan. So when the opportunity arises that Ruth is asking, then it's okay to go through that plan and trust God with how it will turn out. If the story had taken place in another nation, told by someone years later, we might not need chapter 4. We'd have just been told that the fertility gods smiled on Boaz and Ruth, and they had their children. But instead, it appears that Boaz and Ruth held back, and Boaz decided to operate through the proper channels to see if it was okay to marry Ruth. So the beginning of chapter 4, Boaz goes to the city gate. Let me pray before I read the passage. Heavenly Father, open our ears, our hearts, and our minds so that we may receive your word and seek your will. So that we may be encouraged to have faith because of your own faithfulness. Help us to demonstrate that faith in your goodness to others through our own lives and trust as well. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Ruth 4, we'll start with verses 1 through 6. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer, the other person of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And Boaz took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, the other guy who had the option of marrying Ruth, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Just as the threshing floor was a common place in the city gate was another one of those common places. And in ancient villages, the gate was where the elders of the town would gather to discuss the issues of the day, to give advice, and, if it so happened, to be witnesses to agreements between people. We often think of ancient city gates like this. That's the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem. But more often, they were a little bit less imposing. I think that actually is Bethlehem. That's what came up when I looked for ancient Bethlehem Gate. So maybe that is. But a little less imposing than that. But you can see it has chambers where people would stand or sit or sell or check people in, things like that. Often, though, especially for this early stage in Bethlehem here in the book of Ruth, these gates might have just been hedges that kind of overlapped so that someone couldn't just run right into town, especially not a group of people seeking to steal something out or siege something or take something in or cause trouble. It was often very complicated to get through these gates to a town. So it was congested. People would have to go in and out, especially if they had fields. The fields were outside of town and the people came into town. That's where people gathered. So when Boaz knows that he has the opportunity to marry Ruth, but he knows by law there's someone else who has a greater claim on that right, then he goes to the city gate, because that's where the discussion's going to get done. Now, I know this sounds pretty bad, that Ruth had no say. Ruth was just subject to whoever had the legal right to her. But this was a law that was actually in place to protect widows and be sure that they were provided for by somebody. It was put in place for the protection of the most vulnerable. The law said that if a man died and left behind a family, a close male relative of the man had to take that family into his household as something called a kinsman redeemer. Boaz wanted to do this, but this other man was a closer relative. Boaz went to the city gate, and when that man happened to walk by, he said, "Hey, cousin, come here. Let's talk." Then he said, "Hey, elders, hey, you guys are around? Come, let's talk about this." And initially the man says, "Yes, I will buy that field and be the kinsman redeemer." To him, it sounded like the widow of a close relative in need, and if he took care of Naomi, then he would get the land. But Boaz said, "But there's also the daughter-in-law, Ruth, who's not from around here." Just reading the story, we might think this is an even better deal for the guy, but he says, "Well then, I can't do it. It would ruin my house." Now, at first thought, we might assume he's talking about his wife getting upset. What he's really saying is that if he and Ruth have a child, that child might end up becoming his heir. And if so, that would actually be Ruth's late husband's heir. It's not that his immediate household would be ruined. It's that his lineage would technically be the lineage of Elimelech, Naomi's late husband. As we've seen this month, family is a big deal in the book of Ruth. It's a big deal for Naomi, for Ruth, for Boaz. It's a big deal for the Israelites. Maintaining family structures was necessary for maintaining social order. God's promise had to do with family structures. He said he would bless the descendants of Abraham. And well, they're all descendants of Abraham. But the people in this village of Bethlehem, and the people of the nation of Israel, didn't just abide by the laws because they thought it would keep peace and order in society. They didn't just abide by the laws because they were concerned about their lineage. They had these laws because they understood God to be revealed through the law. They understood God to work from generation to generation. God is a long-term God. Now, actually, this might sound pretty sophisticated for a system to have in such an ancient time and place. Amidst the dangers of a primitive society, amidst a world in which most nations believed in gods who were vindictive and whimsical, in the midst of things like famine and war and poverty, the Israelites held to a law that God had ordained. God was not a whimsical God, but the Israelite people were also not whimsical in their dealings with one another. The order and generosity of the people reflected the God that they served. Do our order and generosity reflect the God that we serve? That was God's purpose for working through the law in the first place, so that Israel might show the other nations how to live with one another in subservience to the Almighty. The goodness, the restraint, the respect, setting aside your own impulses, setting aside self for the flourishing of the community. Those are all characteristics that God wanted his people to have in the midst of a world that just did whatever felt good. Because that must be whatever the gods wanted at the time. God wanted his people to be people of hope and faith, not just of opportunism and fear. Of course, some aspects of ancient Israel were still pretty primitive at this time too. A few other nations had written languages. Israel's was still developing, just as the nation was. So contracts were not written down. No, they had a different process for authenticating a contract. Ruth 4, verses 7 through 12. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm, so you can see that they even got past these practices by the time this was written down. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So, when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders, that's why I wore these shoes today, not the ones I had to tie. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." So in order to make a contract, they exchanged a shoe and they recited a bunch of legalese. That's basically what this was, just like the terms, the stuff that you scroll through and then sign that, yes, you've read them on your computer. Now, exchanging a shoe, try doing that the next time you have to sign a contract. Maybe if you're buying a house or a car, Take off your shoe and see if that works. I guess they wanted to prove they were in step with one another. That was the title of the sermon. You had to know it was coming. But seriously, this kind of stuff in the Bible, I find 9 o'clock didn't get that at all. I don't know if that's good or bad. Probably good that they didn't realize it. This kind of stuff in the Bible is fascinating because it tells us a lot about the culture, and there's much more behind it than just a shoe. There are actually still connotations of shoes and what they mean today in the Middle East. It's considered an insult to show somebody the bottom of your shoe. To actually just, sit like that with your foot up. Whoever the bottom of your shoe is facing, it's considered that you're insulting them. Remember when the statue of Saddam Hussein was being dragged through the streets of Baghdad, and people out on the streets were running behind it with their shoes, smacking it? Or in 2008, when President Bush was in Baghdad doing a press conference, and one of the reporters threw his shoe at him? Do you remember that? You can look it up. That one's online. You can look that one up on YouTube. There's still these shoe connotations for insults and shame and things like that. For the ancient Israelites, shoes were what kept them from contact with the ground. It's what kept their feet from getting dirty, what kept them from getting dirty. In their food laws and other laws, they weren't allowed to eat animals that didn't have hooves. The same kind of philosophy applied to shoes. Shoes also keep out various types of things, worms, in certain parts of the world for sure. How many of you are familiar with the footwear brand Toms? For every pair of Toms that you buy, they send a pair to somebody in a third world or impoverished or at-risk place. If you buy a pair of glasses, they do the same. I don't know if they still make glasses. All of this is to say that exchanging a shoe is a pretty big deal. By exchanging a shoe, they're basically saying, may I be considered filthy and unclean if I do not hold to this contract. It's a good deal because, it's a big deal because God's law also emphasized cleanliness. Even in making this agreement, Boaz is demonstrating that it's not just his own desire that he is seeking, but his responsibility under the law of God. He wasn't just abiding by the law for the law's sake, he was abiding by the law for God's sake and for those whom the law protected. This is really one of the greatest takeaways from the book of Ruth. At every step, Boaz considers what is right and what God would have him do. He displays the character of God. He's gracious, he's generous, he deals rightly with others, he seeks even to care for and redeem a foreigner. Boaz was faithful, and all of his actions were connected, from the words of his mouth all the way down to the steps of his shoes. Every part of his body, every step of his life were connected to his faith. So his shoes were as important as his words. It just makes sense, right? If you're a runner, you know how important it is as a runner to have the right shoes, because everything else can get thrown off, even your mood, if you have the wrong shoes. Because your shoes, if they're the wrong ones, they can mess up your feet, your hips, your knees, your foot bone's connected to your leg bone's connected to your hip bone. You know all of that. Now hear the word of the Lord. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. and Jesse fathered David. So Boaz and Ruth got married. And Boaz was not concerned about whose heirs his kids would be or anything like that, like the other potential kinsman redeemer was. Boaz trusted the opportunity that God had given him, trusted the way that God was at work through the law, and trusted that God would continue to work through the generations. Not for Boaz's name and inheritance, but for God's own name and inheritance. Boaz and Ruth, their first child, their son, Obed, was the grandfather of King David. And as we see at the end of the chapter, God works through Boaz's lineage to bring that king. We know eventually God works through that lineage to bring not just a king, but a Savior in Jesus. So what are the things that we can take away from the book of Ruth? Well, first, there's the difference between Yahweh, the God of Israel, and the gods of other nations. The gods that people might seem to follow or think they're following now. The idols that people make in their lives. How many people go through life thinking of God as simply a giver of blessings or punishments, however he feels? It's kind of like those gods of the other nations. Now, it's clear from the Bible that God does deal out blessings and he does deal out retribution. More often than not, though, the retribution is with entire nations or groups of people. As we see in the book of Revelation, maybe churches. Boaz reveals how God's blessings should also be corporate, not just for people, but part of the community. In fact, God's law reveals the same thing. Naomi knew this, and she knew that Boaz would be faithful in sharing his blessings. But God is more than blessings and punishments. God's not just a God of what's right in front of us. He is a long-term God. The faithful of Israel knew this. They knew that when there was a famine, that God was still at work. They knew that when they were in exile, that God was still at work. And God worked out his plan for them by eventually joining them and showing him his full character in Jesus. Also, we see that God seeks to use those who follow him to reach out to others. In this case, it was a foreigner, Ruth, who had come to dwell among the people of Bethlehem. God isn't God of the Israelites just for the sake of the Israelites. God is God overall, and his plan was to use the Israelites to demonstrate that. Likewise, his plan for us as followers of Jesus is to demonstrate who he is as well. God doesn't want us to be followers of Jesus just for our own sakes, but for the world's sake so that he can be revealed through us. Finally, we learn that God welcomes us into the fold. Ruth had gone with Naomi to Bethlehem and had said that Naomi's God would be her God as well. But it took a little while for Ruth to realize everything that this meant. After losing their husbands, Ruth and Naomi went back seeking redemption. They found it not just in Boaz, but in the law that God had put in place and in those who followed that law. If people out in the world are seeking God, do they find him in us? If people are seeking redemption in their lives, do they learn from us that redemption is found in Jesus? You know, throughout the rest of the Old Testament, and certainly in the Gospels as well, we see just how serious some of these Israelites are about the law. But you got to think, the law is what provided for this kind of care, this kind of restraint, and wisdom, trust, and faith in the midst of a world that for hundreds and hundreds of years just kind of seemed crazy, who worshiped these pagan gods who just dealt out retribution and violence and just gave blessings on a whim. The law of Israel was the way that they remained faithful, and God showed his faith if they trusted it. So you can understand why even in Jesus' time, even though people were a little bit overzealous about it, they trusted that law. But they didn't always get it right. So God showed us his true character, not just in the law, but in Jesus. So when we are in a world of confusion and difficulty, and when things seem crazy, how much more should we hold to Jesus? Because then we're not just holding to principles, we can actually point to a person who himself has come as our Redeemer. If people are out in the world seeking God, do they find him in us? If people are seeking redemption in their lives, do they learn from us that that redemption is found in Jesus, not in any measurement of blessing other than Jesus? We can be generous and giving and loving, but unless we're calling people into life with Christ, into being transformed, then we're only going part of the way toward doing our job as Christians. We can give and give, but if we're just doling out for immediate needs, then we aren't revealing that long-term God who desires a relationship with us so much that he came as one of us. People will continue to be in need. People will continue to be sinful and do things that darken their ability to see God, all of us included. But unless we demonstrate the redemption that God offers as long-term, the following Jesus is not just an answer to a need, but a recognition that we live life in subservience to God. We aren't giving people what they truly need, and we aren't growing it in ourselves. Boaz was Ruth's kinsman redeemer. But his job wasn't just done when they showed up and he gave them food. It wasn't just done when he married Ruth and gave her a safe home. It wasn't just done when he brought Ruth into his household. It was done when God worked quite literally through their family for others for generations to come. Likewise, Jesus calls us into his household, the household of the Son of God who is our Redeemer. That's not something we can earn because we're good enough for it, but something that he gives so that we can grow into it, so that we can demonstrate it to others. It's likely that this story of Ruth began getting popular around the time of King David. It was used to demonstrate that everyone in Israel was of the household of David, and that the household was open to the work of God even through foreigners. We are not just in the household of David. We are in the household of Jesus. And just like Isaac, we are children of God by faith. Just as Boaz demonstrated who God is, we can demonstrate who Jesus is, the one who claims us, redeems us, and even dies for us. Not only for our own sake and salvation, but so that we can reveal the character of God through our own trust and faith in him. And as we demonstrate who Jesus is, we join him in helping redeem the world. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.